Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Assembly Health Committee. I'm Richard S. Gilbert, a retired Unitarian Universalist minister, and I speak on my own behalf as well as for the Clergy Advisory Board of Compassionate Choices and as a member of New York Unitarian Universalist Network for Medical Aid in Dying. I speak in support of Medical Aid in Dying Act 2383A. Copies of that statement, as well as a background paper I have written on the history of this issue, are available to you. There are many reasons to pass this legislation. Having read the legislation before you, I'm impressed with the thoughtful safeguards and for patients, doctors, and others. 7 states, Oregon, Washington, Montana, Vermont, California, Colorado, and most recently Hawaii, and the District of Columbia already have medical aid in dying through legislation or court decision. And there have been no major problems, as the research has indicated. No negative impacts on patients, doctors, family members, or vulnerable groups. And no evidence of coercion or abuse or a slippery slope. Polling indicates a strong majority of New Yorkers of all faiths support medical aid in dying. In fact, as a minister, I have welcomed the increased discussion of this issue, the discussion of preparation for death among members of my congregations. Several European countries, as well as Canada, have aid in dying laws. A number of medical groups have spoken in support. My own denomination, the Unitarian Universalist Association, passed a resolution on this topic in 1988. However, I speak to you out of my personal experiences, having been a parish minister for over 57 years. I have shared life's final exit with hundreds of people. I've often been amazed at the dignity with which death is faced. However, too many times I have been saddened by needless suffering, as people facing imminent death through disease are kept alive through what has been called the tyranny of technology. As a person of faith, I believe that what is important is not mere prolongation of biological life. What is vital is the freedom to live a meaningful life and to die a peaceful and dignified death. We are all terminal, just penciled in. All of us are sentenced to die. The questions are when and how and who decides. When is a factor over which we have limited control. How is a question for which we wish to have some choice. Who decides is important because we wish to maintain our moral agency to the end of our days. And while everyone wants this kind of dignified death, we have our differences about its meaning, and I fully respect those of different views, religious or other. However, I do not believe that any group which opposes medical aid in dying has the right to deny that freedom to those of a different religious faith or view who support it. If you don't believe in it, don't do it. Having officiated at nearly 500 memorial services, I know something of the distinction between death by medical death and suicide. I've spent many hours by the bedsides of the dying and marvel at their courage, but I find myself unable to answer those who tell me they wish to die rather than to face a prolonged and unnecessary suffering which serves no useful purpose. Suicides are committed by those who can continue to live but choose not to do so, are done mostly in isolation, often impulsively and violently, and are tragic. Medical aid in dying is the opposite. Persons who wish to live have terminal illnesses. Decisions to end those lives are made voluntarily in consultation with physician and family. Dying is done in a supportive community in which the person is surrounded by love. A few illustrations. I think of Margaret, my 95-year-old grandmother, curled in a fetal position for months in a nursing home, unable to die, able only to cry like a baby. I think of Lou, a man of 85 who, facing inevitable death by disease, literally starved himself to death at home, a slow and agonizing process because he could not access medical aid in dying. Radio personality Diane Rehm writes and speaks passionately about the severe suffering of her husband who had Parkinson's disease. She movingly recounts the pain as he starved himself to death. I think of Helen, an elderly woman who stockpiled powerful drugs for herself, but had a lethal stroke before she could take them. I was at her bedside in death. I think of Mary Jane, a woman in her 90s who wanted desperately to die rather than to face a lingering death. I think of Jim, who shot himself, and of Roy and Doreen, who took their own lives rather than endure a prolonged dying. I think of Marcia, who immolated herself on a public street. So there is a real difference between medical aid in dying and suicide. Suicide, which is in death, in despair, and anger. Physician-assisted suicide is simply not an appropriate term for that which we are discussing this morning and this afternoon. The American Public Health Association, the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine, the American Medical Women's Association, and the American Association of Suicidology agree we should not use that term. Medical aid in dying legislation provides the freedom for persons who are terminally ill to be the subjects of their dying and not the objects of medical technology or arbitrary rules. No one is coerced in this process. Ultimate decisions are left to the individual in consultation with medical professionals, friends, family, and their religious counselors. Of course, such decisions are difficult. There are no computer algorithms for calculating action. We live in the mystery of death. We work in the dark. We do what we can. We give what we have. We live as we are able. If we cannot solve the riddle, and I wager we cannot, we learn to live with it and to enjoy it. So we prepare for death by living a life. The manner in which we face death says a great deal about how we have lived life. And for me, as a minister, death is not a punishment, not a cruel fate from which I need rescue, but part and parcel of my life, a natural and necessary part of it. As people of faith, we affirm the right to live in dignity. It stands to reason that we also affirm the right to die with dignity. Death is a part of the life process. Sometimes death is friend, not enemy. In summary, I make the following affirmations. Healthcare is a universal right of all persons, and I have testified before this committee before for Medicare for all, and I still emphatically support that. That right should include a continuum of care, from pain management to comfort care to hospice to medical aid in dying, all on a continuum. We already grant persons the freedom to refuse treatment at the end of life. Medical aid in dying is an extension of that freedom. Ethically, I see no difference. Autonomy is honored in both cases. It is the last right of a human being. The quality of life, not the mere prolongation of biological life, is decisive. Sometimes the greatest reverence for life is to end human suffering. I'm 81 years old, and I'm healthy, and I hope for some good time yet. Yet I know my days are numbered. At one time, I thought of ending my life on a triple diamond slope, taking off on my 100th birthday and skiing into oblivion. More recently, I have pictured my deathbed surrounded by friends and loved ones, giving out some last gems of wisdom or perhaps a final sermon. I don't know how I will end my days, but I am comforted by the assurance that they do not have to be spent in a painful, lingering, dying process. All these are reasons why I support medical aid in dying legislation. And so I urge each member of this committee to reflect on your own personal wishes, those of your loved ones, and those people who must make the hard decisions of life and death, as must we all. Thank you.
Thank you.